Once hailed as the richest nation in Latin America, Venezuela is now synonymous with hyperinflation, empty shelves, and a currency collapse that has devastated millions of lives. But how did this once oil-rich country fall into economic chaos? Today on News Nexus, we take a deep dive into the Venezuelan crisis and the dramatic story behind the fall of the Bolívar. To understand the present, we must first step back in time. Venezuela, once known as the Saudi Arabia of South America, discovered vast oil reserves in the early 20th century. By the 1950s, it was one of the wealthiest nations in the region. With booming oil exports, Venezuela built modern cities, highways, and a strong middle class. But this prosperity was dangerously dependent on oil prices. The modern story begins with Hugo Chávez, elected president in 1998 on promises of eradicating poverty and redistributing oil wealth. Chávez's socialist reforms lifted millions from poverty through free education, healthcare, and subsidized food programs. His policies were ambitious, but they came at a heavy price. Instead of saving for a rainy day or investing oil profits in diverse industries, Venezuela became even more reliant on oil. When global oil prices were high, the economy appeared stable, even generous. But behind the scenes, the foundations were eroding. Chávez's government nationalized industries, discouraged private investment, and increased state spending dramatically. The economy became trapped in a cycle of dependency, with little room for innovation or growth outside of oil. In 2014, the global oil market collapsed. Overnight, Venezuela lost its primary source of income. The government, faced with budget shortfalls and foreign debt, responded in the worst way possible, printing more money. This decision triggered one of the worst cases of hyperinflation the modern world has ever seen. Hyperinflation is an economic nightmare where prices rise so rapidly that money becomes virtually worthless. Venezuela's inflation rate skyrocketed into uncharted territory. In 2018 alone, it hit an astonishing 1,700,000%. Imagine buying a loaf of bread for $2 in the morning and returning that evening to find it costs $10. The Bolívar, once a symbol of national pride, became so devalued that people used it for arts and crafts, even wallpaper. Carrying stacks of cash became the new normal. To purchase basic necessities like groceries or medicine, Venezuelans would carry bags of bolívars. Even at high denominations, the money couldn't keep up with the skyrocketing prices. The currency had collapsed. In an attempt to stabilize the economy, the Venezuelan government introduced new versions of its currency. In 2008, the Bolívar Fuerte replaced the original Bolívar, cutting 3 zeros from banknotes, but inflation persisted. In 2010, the government unveiled the Bolívar Soberano, chopping off 5 more zeros. And in 2021, another rebranding created the Bolívar Digital, this time slashing 6 zeros. But each reset was like putting a bandage on a bullet wound. The real issue was not the number of zeros, but the loss of faith in the currency and the government's economic policies. As the Bolívar lost value, Venezuelans adapted. Many switched to using US dollars, cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin, or even bartering goods and services instead of relying on cash. The collapse of the Bolívar was not just a financial event, but a human tragedy. Everyday life became a struggle for survival. Families found it impossible to afford basic food, even with entire paychecks. Over 75% of Venezuelans reported involuntary weight loss, as food shortages swept the nation. Supermarkets were often empty, and long lines formed outside bakeries and pharmacies as people waited for hours, hoping to buy necessities before prices doubled yet again. The social consequences were even more severe. Over 7 million Venezuelans have left their homeland, creating one of the largest migrant crises in modern Latin American history. Entire families walked across borders into Colombia, Brazil, and further into South America, often with nothing but a backpack. Venezuela's public services also collapsed. Hospitals ran out of medicine. Electricity blackouts became routine. Schools struggled to operate without funding or supplies. Crime soared as desperate people turned to theft and violence. The country's economy had not only failed, society was beginning to break down. At the same time, the political crisis deepened. President Nicolás Maduro, Chávez's successor, was re-elected in 2018 under highly controversial circumstances. International observers accused his government of election fraud and human rights violations. The United States, the European Union, and other Western nations imposed heavy sanctions, targeting Venezuela's oil exports and financial systems. The Maduro government blamed what it called economic warfare from foreign countries for the worsening crisis. But most economists agreed that the root causes were decades of economic mismanagement, corruption, and policy failure, not sanctions alone. Faced with a collapsing economy, Maduro's administration looked for new ways to generate revenue and bypass sanctions. The government sold off gold reserves, entered oil-for-goods deals with China and Russia, and launched its own cryptocurrency, the petro, which it claimed was backed by oil. But the petro failed to win international trust and did little to stabilize the economy. Even Venezuela's mighty oil industry, once the envy of the world, was in decline. Years of underinvestment, mismanagement, and sanctions left the state oil company, PDVSA, in ruins. Oil production dropped to historic lows, further starving the country of hard currency. In this dark chapter of Venezuelan history, there are still signs of resilience and hope. Some cities have experienced a fragile return of commerce, largely thanks to the widespread use of US dollars. Digital platforms and cryptocurrencies have allowed Venezuelans to bypass their broken banking system. Independent journalists, activists, and non-governmental organizations continue to work, often under extreme conditions, to provide information and humanitarian aid. The story of Venezuela is a powerful lesson on the dangers of over-reliance on a single resource, reckless economic policy, and authoritarian rule. Hyperinflation didn't happen overnight. It was the result of years of small decisions, each chipping away at the foundations of trust and stability. Today, Venezuela's future is uncertain. The country has an educated population, rich natural resources, and an enduring spirit. But restoring its economy will require bold reforms, international cooperation, and perhaps most importantly, the rebuilding of public trust. The fall of the Bolívar is more than just a cautionary tale for economists. It's a reminder that behind every economic statistic are real people. Families who lost their homes, children who grew up too fast, and entire communities displaced by forces beyond their control. If you found this video informative, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to News Nexus for more deep dives into global economic stories. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.